Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, bienvenidas y bienvenidos todos. Soy Luciano Andrenacci, esta es la reunión de presentación del área de Estado, Estado, Administración Pública y Políticas Públicas de la Escuela de Política y Gobierno de la Universidad Nacional de San Martín. Hoy es nuestra primera reunión formal. Muchísimas gracias a todas y todos los que se interesaron en acompañarnos. Y en especial muchísimas gracias a nuestros dos invitados, Guy Peters y Michael Barzelay, que aceptaron ser de la partida, hablando con nosotros sobre las cosas que les interesan. Esto es una muy breve presentación. Me gustaría también presentarles a Ricardo Gutiérrez y Carlos Acuña. Ricardo Gutiérrez es el decano de la Escuela de Política y Gobierno de la Universidad Nacional de San Martín y nos apoyó muchísimo en esta empresa de crear la unidad de investigación de políticas públicas. Y Carlos Acuña fue el generador de la idea y quien ha venido empujando hace ya varios años porque esta unidad existiera y que se transformara en las cosas, lo que queremos que se transforme, un espacio de intercambio entre investigadores y un espacio de coordinación de programas de formación, y quizás de un modo más informal, en un lugar agradable para investigadores docentes y para estudiantes interesados en los procesos estatales, ¿sí? En el marco de una escuela especializada en la ciencia política de la Universidad Nacional de San Martín. Sin más, yo quiero invitar a que nos saluden Ricardo Gutiérrez y después Carlos Acuña, y después pasar a escuchar a nuestros invitados, Guy y Michael, para los que voy a hacer una breve presentación también, y después espero que tengamos tiempo de escuchar opiniones, preguntas, intercambios, etc. Ricardo, bienvenido.
Gracias, Luciano. Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Como decano, para mí es una alegría estar hoy aquí en el lanzamiento del área de Estado, Administración y Políticas Públicas, como también es un honor contar con la participación de dos académicos de gran prestigio internacional que han hecho grandes aportes en el estudio de los temas que hoy nos convocan. Thank you, Guy Peters and Michael Barzelay, for joining us today. We are honored with your presence, and I am sure we will be delighted with your presentations. Thank you. El lanzamiento del área de Estado, Administración y Políticas Públicas, que fue aprobada por el Consejo de Escuela a fines del año pasado, no surge de la nada. La escuela tiene ya una trayectoria en la formación en Administración y Políticas Públicas, la que incluye tanto la licenciatura en Administración Pública como varias maestrías y especializaciones, entre ellas la maestría en Planificación y Evaluación de Políticas Públicas que dirige el propio Luciano. Además, les cuento que el año pasado, gracias al trabajo colectivo liderado por Carlos y por Luciano, presentamos ante la CONIAU la propuesta de un doctorado en Administración y Políticas Públicas. Así esperamos en 2 o 3 años lanzar el nuevo doctorado y con ello completar todo el ciclo de formación en el área, desde la licenciatura hasta el doctorado. En paralelo, la escuela cuenta desde siempre con numerosas investigaciones sobre Estado, Administración y Políticas Públicas. Hasta ahora lo que ha sucedido es que esas investigaciones surgían básicamente de iniciativas individuales de nuestras investigadores e investigadores, sin mucha articulación entre ellas. Con la creación del área, justamente buscamos darle más realce a esas investigaciones y fortalecer la sinergia tanto entre las iniciativas individuales como entre la investigación y la formación. Por eso, para finalizar, quiero agradecer a Carlos y a Luciano y a todo el equipo que conforma el área por ponerse la tarea al hombro, porque estoy seguro que el nuevo área colocará a la escuela en una posición aún más destacada en el campo de estos estudios sobre Estado, Administración y Políticas Públicas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. Ojalá que sea así. Haremos lo posible. Carlos, bienvenido.
Gracias, Luciano, y gracias a todos y a todas por estar presentes. A ver, una muy breve introducción al área de investigación de Estado, Administración y Políticas Públicas. el análisis del accionar estatal y sus implicancias creo que muestra dos grandes tradiciones, muchísimas tradiciones, pero sobre todo nos interesa marcar dos. La primera, que se dispara desde la ciencia política y que tiene como foco legítimo, yo diría, fundamental, la lucha de intereses y actores por la definición de políticas públicas. ¿Quién gana y quién pierde? ¿Cuáles son los intereses priorizados por el Estado? ¿Cuáles son los intereses excluidos por el Estado? Esta línea de trabajo muestra una clara fortaleza que tiene que ver con entender la distribución del poder sociopolítico, algo que es fundamental para el tipo de análisis que queremos llevar adelante. Por el otro lado, durante años hemos discutido y hemos tenido esa sensación sobre la debilidad que muestra una parte importante de este tipo de análisis, porque son análisis que tienden a veces a asumir que resuelta la lucha política, resuelto quién gana y quién pierde, corre el riesgo de considerar al Estado como neutro. El Estado aparecía como una caja negra que, habiendo ganadores y perdedores, el Estado cumplía y llevaba adelante la política de los ganadores. La otra gran tradición es la tradición que se dispara desde, en líneas generales, la sociología y además lo que en ciertos ámbitos se llaman las ciencias de la administración. Esa línea de trabajo y análisis que se concentra en las organizaciones, que se concentra tradicionalmente en el entendimiento de las burocracias, las capacidades estatales, y el análisis sobre por qué y cómo se da el accionar estatal. El análisis de la gestión, de la administración pública. Las fortalezas de este tipo de aproximación creo que están claras. ¿Por qué? Porque es un tipo de aproximación que reconoce que el Estado no es necesariamente neutro, que las capacidades estatales son fundamentales, las capacidades de gestión, de administración estatal, son fundamentales también para entender la distribución de poder en una sociedad. Las debilidades de esta línea de análisis, en general han tenido que ver con que corren el riesgo de apuntar a entender las dinámicas de administración, de gestión, divorciadas de la lucha política. Foco algo excluyente en las estructuras, en las organizaciones. Estas dos escuelas, o cuerpos de literatura, yo diría, cuerpos de líneas de investigación, se han mostrado históricamente en tensión. Yo diría, y acá coincidimos con gran parte de la escuela, yo diría que estos dos cuerpos nos han mostrado insuficiente diálogo, hasta cierto divorcio y resquemor. Una lógica se han desarrollado como lógicas bastante excluyentes una de otros, y en definitiva nuestra conclusión es que este divorcio ha empobrecido el entendimiento del accionar estatal y sus implicancias. ¿Por qué me refiero a esto? Para que se entienda qué es lo que se está gestando con el área de investigación en Estado, Administración y Políticas Públicas. El área en realidad se inscribe en un doble proceso. En primer lugar, en el proceso de construcción institucional de la Escuela de Política y Gobierno, la que acaba de hacer referencia a Ricardo. Cae dentro de la lógica con la que se ha ido desenvolviendo la Escuela de Política de Gobierno y Gobierno de la Universidad de San Martín. Pero por el otro lado, el área también se inscribe en aquellas líneas teóricas que reniegan de esta tensión. Aquellas líneas teóricas que consideran a los focos en la administración pública y en la lógica, en la economía política de las políticas públicas, como piezas ineludibles del entendimiento del accionar estatal y sus implicancias. Por eso, es que los objetivos que persigue el área tienen que ver con generar un espacio de diálogo, de debate, de activo diálogo, activo debate, yo diría, que fortalezca este tipo de entendimiento. Un entendimiento que apunte a articular, a crear puentes entre estas dos tradiciones, yo diría, teóricas, históricas, que ha mostrado el análisis del Estado. Hoy abrimos nuestros encuentros debates en diálogo con dos grandes pensadores del Estado, la gestión y las políticas públicas. A Guy y a Michael, por supuesto, mi agradecimiento por acompañarnos. To both of you, thanks so much for sharing with us your thoughts and knowledge. Eso es lo que yo quería transmitirles como introducción a la lógica del área. Y ahora lo que haría, le pasaría la palabra a Luciano para que introduzca a Guy y a Michael y explique la lógica de nuestro encuentro y su dinámica. Gracias a todos y a todas.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Bueno, mientras estábamos introduciendo todo esto, se fueron sumando muchísimas personas a las que le quiero dar la bienvenida. Personas de muchos lugares, muchísimas personas de Argentina, pero también de Brasil, de Colombia, de los Estados Unidos, del Reino Unido. Bienvenidos todos. Welcome all of you who are non-Spanish speakers, and thank you for giving us some minutes of your time and joining us tonight. Bueno, tendría muchas cosas para decir de Guy y de Michael, pero voy a tratar de ser breve. I hope it's not awkward for you, Guy and Michael, that I introduce you in Spanish. But I know that you guys speak Spanish well enough as to follow what I say, more or less, or at least to be sure that I'm not, saying something completely unexpected. Bueno, quiero decirles que, si alguno se preguntaba qué significa la B de Big Guy Peters, la B significa Brainerd, que sería algo parecido a como si Guy se llamara Cerebrito en castellano. Digamos, es un nombre que supongo que es por eso que lo mantiene oculto en la mayor parte de los usos. Estamos con dos increíbles carreras que nos acompañan hoy. Guy da clases desde 1969. Se doctoró en 1970 en la Universidad de Michigan. Lleva 40 años trabajando, casi 40 años, si leo bien el currículum, en la Universidad de Pittsburgh, en Estados Unidos. Lleva 4 doctorados honoris causa, el último nada más ni nada menos que la Universidad de Leuven, ¿no? Y ese además nos ayuda desde hace algunos años como fundador y presidente de la Asociación Internacional de Políticas Públicas, que es una organización muy reciente, pero que ha hecho una muy rápida carrera de colocarse en el centro de la discusión, de generar un lugar para discutir políticas públicas, porque junta las dos tradiciones de nuestro campo a las que se refería Carlos, ¿no? Dos increíbles carreras. Michael Barzelay da clases desde 1985. Mismo año en el que se doctoraba en la Universidad de Yale, bajo la supervisión de nada más ni nada menos que Charles Lindblom, ¿no? 10 años en la Universidad de Harvard y ya 25 años en la London School of Economics and Political Science. Estamos hablando de carreras que han acompañado el debate de política pública a lo largo de muchísimos años, ¿no? No precisamente jóvenes promisorios todavía, pero con una carrera muy larga. Pero no solo esto, dos perspectivas globales. Guy, sí, hacer la lista es difícil de currículums tan largos, pero Guy ha sido profesor por lo menos en Alemania, China, Dinamarca, Holanda, Noruega y Suecia, además de los Estados Unidos. Y ha sido profesor visitante, investigador visitante en una veintena de lugares, incluyendo Argentina y México, ¿no? Michael ha sido profesor también, además de los Estados Unidos, en Brasil, Francia, Japón, Nueva Zelanda, visitante en media docena de lugares del mundo. Y por último, a riesgo de aburrirlos con currículums presentados más tradicionalmente, son dos perspectivas complejas de las políticas públicas, ¿no? Guy es un politólogo un autor serial, politólogo interesado en las burocracias, la mecánica de gobierno, los procesos de políticas públicas, de allí a la administración pública comparada, los problemas de coordinación gubernamental, y últimamente foco en la cuestión del diseño de políticas públicas. Es difícil no ver varias líneas conductoras en esa producción. Yo diría la que a mí más me parece como conductora es cuál es la verdadera relación entre política y políticas, si uno quiere, ¿no? La provocación. Michael, un politólogo también interesado en el funcionamiento del Estado, y de allí en la práctica y la teoría de la gestión de políticas públicas, que ha iniciado una gesta refundadora de la disciplina de la gestión de políticas públicas como una disciplina que cruza aspectos académicos con aspectos profesionales, y cargado con algunas de las consecuencias negativas de intentar crear zonas híbridas del conocimiento. Autor y supervisor serial de estudios de caso, ¿no? E incluso a veces en abierta disidencia con la universidad madre de los estudios de caso, la Universidad de Harvard. Y su línea conductora quizás haya sido la pregunta, ¿cómo funcionan realmente las políticas públicas? ¿Sí? Es quizá la persona a quien uno le puede hacer esa pregunta, ¿no? Finalmente, dos cosas en común, dos académicos con serios signos de hibridez, ¿no? No solo son profesores y académicos, son consultores y asesores de organismos internacionales y gobiernos de varios países. Y me gustaría decir esto por último, son dos proverbiales promotores de sus estudiantes y sus colegas en todo el mundo, sin pedir nada a cambio, como la participación de ellos en la reunión de hoy. Entonces es una alegría y un honor tener este acompañamiento de ellos para nosotros, y esperemos que también, espero que reciban esta invitación también como un homenaje nuestro a sus carreras, y a nuestro interés en lo que escriben y lo que dicen. Bueno, ya fui muy lejos. Les preguntamos a Guy y a Michael sus opiniones. Les pedimos a Guy y a Michael que nos contaran sus opiniones respecto de la evolución reciente, la diferenciación y el entrelazamiento de la investigación en los dos campos de estudio que atraviesan la nueva área nuestra, a los que se refería Carlos, el análisis de políticas públicas, ciencia de las políticas, y la administración, gestión o gerenciamiento, en parte porque ambos son dos personajes fundamentales en esos campos, aunque no están uno en uno y otro en el otro. Ambos juegan en varias canchas, se dan el lujo de jugar en varias canchas a la vez, usando un lenguaje argentino. Entonces quizá por eso también son particularmente interesantes de ser interrogados a este respecto. Les vamos a dar, primero lo digo en castellano y luego en inglés, les vamos a dar a los amigos hasta 30 minutos cada uno para exponer. Pueden usar lo que quieran de esos 30 minutos, y luego bienvenimos preguntas de los asistentes. Pueden usar para eso algunas de las formas que tiene el Zoom, de levantar la mano, o simplemente conectar la cámara y vamos a hacer un saludo, y yo los voy a identificar tratando de buscarlos, porque estamos llegando a los 60 participantes. Estoy muy agradecido de tantas personas. Now in English. So, dear friends, we will give you up to 30 minutes to talk about actually whatever you want to talk. And then we will welcome questions, comments from everybody assisting to the meeting. And then, of course, I'll ask you to be friendly enough as to try to answer them. Maybe some of the questions will be in Spanish, but I know that you guys can perfectly well make sense of the questions. And if not, you can always ask me or us, and we will collectively make communication possible. Thank you again for being with us. I would like to start inviting Guy to speak, and then Michael, in that order. Guy, whenever you want, we're all ears.
Okay, well, thank you, Luciano. Thank you, Carlos. Thanks to everyone. I have slides. Would you rather not have slides, or would it be easier if I had the slides?
Oh no, you're very welcome to go ahead with your slides. You know how to share the screen? You
Yep.
technically can do
Yes,
that.
I used to. There we go.
Right.
There we are.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, the way, I asked Luciano what I was supposed to do. And he said that I should try to talk about how to put together public administration, public policy, or policy analysis to something, can they be combined into something broadly termed public policy? So that's what I want to talk about. So, but first, congratulations to on the new research center. Look forward to seeing what you're going to be doing in the future. And thanks for the invitation. Now, so we have two fields here that are very closely related: public administration and policy analysis. And it's to some extent like George Bernard Shaw said about the United States and the United Kingdom, were two countries separated by a common language. Public administration and public policy are two subject matters separated by a common problem: how to govern. So what we're trying to do then is to figure out how to put these two fields, are they compatible? How do they work together for governing? Now, sometimes efforts are made to differentiate them, to make them different, both academically in terms of the writing and also institutionally, having separate schools of public administration, having separate departments of public policy. So sometimes we make these artificial separations, or maybe not so artificial, as I'll come to in a moment. So the better question may be how to integrate them effectively, which is much easier said than done. But each of the fields themselves is divided. And importantly, I think, is to understand what's going on within each of the fields. So especially public policy. So we have policy analysis, which is largely prospective, largely dominated by economists, statisticians, operations research people, so forth. We're trying then to advise policymakers on what's the best possible policy. Now, I'm obviously, for the sake of time, so condensing some of the differences here. So we have policy analysis. Then in political science, more so, we have something that's usually called policy studies, where we try to explain, particularly using political variables, why certain policy choices have been made. So it's much more emphasis on public policy choices as a dependent variable, rather than thinking about it prospectively and trying to think about how we make better policy. And these different approaches have different ontologies, different methodologies. And to that, we can add specific policy areas. So I teach health policy and when I'm at home. And so there's a whole field in the School of Public Health dealing with health policy, which deals with policy analysis rather differently than we would in the School of Public Policy, simply because of the expertise and the close linkages with the health professionals. So public administration, however, is perhaps less divided. The main division seems to be between public administration and public management. So public administration are sort of old-fashioned guys like me who are really interested in the politics of policy, how public administration fits into the political system, whereas the public management folks are interested in just that, management. So they tend to be assuming essentially almost a generic management. Now, again, I'm sort of stereotyping here, so don't jump on me too badly about this. So this is a stereotype, but to some extent also true. So that public management and public administration are dealing with the same subject matter, but often dealing with them differently. So can we put policy analysis and public administration to some broad field we call public policy? Answer, yes and no. And I'll try to explain why yes and no. They're natural allies that need each other. But the educational and intellectual perspectives may differ. But we deal, both of these two domains of research deal with many of the same things. They deal with organizations, and particularly organizations in the public sector. And perhaps most importantly, they deal with decision-making. So we have to figure out how decisions are made, both for making policy and making administrative decisions, even down to the street level bureaucrats who make day-to-day decisions about individual citizens. So probably the one thing that most unifies them, I would argue, is decision-making. Implementation is a part of that. Both of them are interested in evaluation. They may be interested in evaluation somewhat differently. So historically, at least, public policy analysis has tried to deal with deeper evaluations of cause and effect. Whereas, particularly after new public management, public administration has been more interested in performance management, which is shorter term, more about implementation. And both talk about collaborative management or collaborative policymaking, particularly in the year of our Lord 2021, where collaboration has become one of the buzzwords. But I want to talk about two ways I think we can bring the two together effectively. And those of you who know me will be surprised at these two ways. They're two of my sort of particular obsessions about policy and administration. But let me indulge me. So let me try to talk about them as a way to bring policy analysis and public administration together. They're policy design and governance. They're not the only ways, but they're two ways that are worth considering. And governance in particular also brings in some of the political science that I heard Carlos talking about in his introductory comments. So the governance side of this is much more political, perhaps, than the other two. So first of all, policy design. And this is one of the flavors of the month, one of the current emphases in public policy, or again, at least I think so. But emphasis has been on policy choice, and particularly instrument choice. But it should bring in together a much broader array of concerns about public policy. Now, it's not all elements of policy design do so. Some focus particularly just on instrumentation. But I would argue that policy design needs to be much broader. And in particular, sorry, policy design has four elements. Sorry about the coughing, but I had surgery on my throat about a year ago, and I still have problems as a result of it. So, I sometimes sound like I'm auditioning for the Godfather movies, but anyway. So there arguably, policy design has these four elements. One is causation. So if we want to design a good policy, we have to know what's causing the problem. Now, and there are multiple alternative versions of causation. You think about crime. What causes crime? Is it genetic? Is it upbringing? Is it poverty? What causes crime? So there are alternatives. But to deal with the designing a policy, we have to settle upon a cause. We may be wrong, but we need to settle on a cause. Okay. Secondly is instrumentation. And most of the work in design has been on policy instruments, the tools of government, going back to Christopher Hood. And so which tools do you choose, both individually and collectively, to deal with policy problems? Then intervention. And by intervention here, this is where we bring in public administration. So to design a program effectively, a policy effectively, we have to know how it's going to be implemented. We have to know, essentially, then, a model of intervention, how to put this into effect in the society. And last, but certainly not least, all these are bound up in values and evaluation. So what values are we pursuing with the policies? Sorry, and how do we apply them through the evaluative process? So how does this integrate? Well, first of all, as an implicit process notion, you sort of go through these steps. Secondly, is much of the policy design is integrated around the need to understand causation and everything that builds upon causation. But perhaps most importantly, it recognizes that intervention and implementation are crucial and have to be designed along with the rest of policy. So therefore, you can't really do policy design or public policy without thinking very hard about public administration. So you need both elements to make an effective policy design and to make that design work in practice. Now, so the second alternative I raised as an alternative for integrating policy and policy analysis and public administration is governance. Now, the numbers of governance are, the definitions of governance are numerous and sometimes conflicting. But I like to keep a fairly simple notion of governance as steering. So the notion of governance then is steering the economy and the society toward collective goals. So we have to have some means of setting goals, and then we try to steer to get there. Again, many ways of conceptualizing, but this is the most generic. And then we can talk about governance with adjectives. We can talk about state-centric governance. We can talk about interactive governance. We can talk about collaborative governance. So we may want to specify it by using adjectives, but fundamentally we're talking about trying to get the economy and society towards certain goals, which we hope are set democratically, but the same logic works in autocratic systems as well. You're still steering toward those goals. Then how does this integrate? Well, first of all, the process. So if you look at a process notion of governance, it looks almost identical to the policy process. So my good friend and colleague Jean-Pierre and I did a book on governance theory a few years ago, and one of the chapters was on process, and it looked very much like the policy process, and it is. Secondly, and then substantively. So again, the governance process is almost identical to the policy process. And then I'm mentioning the book by Jean-Pierre and myself in 2016. And to govern, you need to do many of the same things that you do to make policy, from identifying goals through to implementation, evaluation, and feedback. So the governance process and the policy process are virtually identical. The major difference may be, though, that governance is more overtly political. Public policy is inherently political, but sometimes our analyses of policy tend to hide the political nature behind good economic analysis or statistics, whereas governance is much more overtly political in the way of thinking. And also governance is very much concerned with goals and goal setting. And then the substance of governance and public policy. You ask the basic question: if you're going to steer, how do you steer? Well, you steer through public policy. So the only way that governments and their partners in the private sector have of steering is through policy. That's how they get the economy and the society to certain places that they want, and presumably the society wants. So policy instruments are governance instruments. We can style them differently, but they're basically fundamentally the same. And likewise, we steer through implementation. So when you're actually putting the programs, the policies into effect through implementation, then we are steering and very directly involved with steering. And we can also then think about values, bring in good governance. Now, the World Bank's notion of good governance is largely about the rule of law and anti-corruption, which is fine, and all of which is important, but may not go far enough. But that's still an important contrast between the standard reliance on utilitarian values in policy analysis. So if you think of something like cost-benefit analysis, the underlying logic is utilitarianism. Most of our policy analytic tools are utilitarian. How I got into this is, you may not care, but how I got into the policy business was I wound up directing a school of public policy or a program of public policy, I should say, at Tulane. And unlike in most public policy programs, this was for undergraduates. And it was undergraduates embedded in a liberal arts curriculum. So it was a very liberal arts college. And we were bringing in this nasty sort of practical stuff about public policy. And so we spent I spent a whole term team teaching a course with a philosopher, trying to figure out whether we could have non-utilitarian value systems for public policy. It was fascinating for me. I'm not sure about the students, but it's fascinating for me. But it's still a fundamental question. So much of our thinking about policy is based upon those sort of basic utilitarian principles. But we can also focus on other values: participation, service delivery, and more recently, inclusion. So I just finished writing a paper for OECD and the Koreans on the inclusive state, and really trying to then to bring in a whole set of different values into thinking about what the state does and how it governs. So we can bring in those alternative value systems. But then, if I step back now and go back to the question that Luciano and Carlos set for me, do we really want to integrate policy analysis and public administration? And how fully do we want to integrate them? Aren't there gains from specialization and a dialogue between real specialists, and bringing in even more specialties, like again, the health policy people and my philosophers and operations research guys and so forth? How do we, are we better off having real specialists who then talk to one another rather than trying to create some sort of hodgepodge, bringing together things? So I think it's a real academic question about what's the best way to proceed, not only in academia, but also in the real world, trying to make and implement better policy. So there's, I would argue, some danger in over-inclusiveness here. We want to do them both well, but do them in their own domains. Otherwise, in Giovanni Sartori's terms, the concepts we use, they lose their intention. That is, we have to lop off some of the defining concepts or defining attributes of a concept to make it fit into both camps. And think about, for example, decision-making. And just again, to stereotype, but public administration talks a lot about incrementalism in decision-making. Public policy people tend to talk more about bounded rationality, talking about very much the same thing, but the concepts have different meanings, different intention, and then trying to create some sort of hodgepodge out of the two may in fact undermine both. Or as Aaron Wildowski said, it was something like this: it's important to keep kosher, to keep meat and milk separate. And he was talking about something slightly different, but not terribly different. But again, there are also the benefits for trying to create some sort of unified version of policy science or public policy studies. So what are we administering in public administration? We're administering policy. And how do we make policy work? We make it work through public administration. So some gains there. So As you probably figured out, the conclusion is that there's no definite answer. It's a matter of taste to some extent. So I was reminded, Harry Truman, when he was president, said he wanted a one-armed economic advisor, because his economic advisors kept saying on the one hand this, but on the other hand that. And so I've sort of done what Harry wouldn't have liked. I've said on the one hand this and on the other hand that. But also this may be a question then of what the intention is. So pedagogically, it may be useful to bring them together or not. For research, I would argue probably more so, and in practical terms, perhaps particularly so, because we do have to think about simultaneously about what is good policy and what is good implementation. So I'll stop there and let Michael give us the real answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kai. It's a pleasure to have you and to hear you with us. Would you please stop sharing your screen for a second?
Yes,
so that
I'm working on it.
Yeah, okay.
There we go.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks again.
Yep.
Michael, Professor Barzelay, you're very welcome to start whenever you want. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, can you hear me? Okay.
Perfectly well, loud and clear.
Very good. Thank you very much for the invitation. I wish I could be with you live. I did have an opportunity to visit UNSAM in July of 2019, I think it was, for a conference. And in fact, there's some familiar faces in the Zoom gallery at the moment, which I appreciate. And I also appreciate this opportunity to, I don't know, socialize different ideas, compare different ideas on a broad question. I thought I would, in preparing for this, mainly talk about this book that I wrote and how it might relate. But I think given the introductory sort of comments of Carlos in particular and what we've just heard, I'm just going to riff a little bit on what I've heard and improvise. And then I think that might set up more of a back and forth, if I could. So just recapping a little bit of what Carlos said that stuck with me and that I kind of wrote down, because I think it could be a way to frame the questions. I think it's quite fruitful. So what I heard is that, I mean, the given is that you have state, politics, administration, all in play as nouns, and you have an institutional setup in your department, and you have an enterprise with education going from undergrad through specialist programs and so on. So it's quite broad in terms of its interface with the learning environments. And so those are kind of givens, right? There's a new program that suggests opportunity that you didn't have before. It's all very positive. And then the kind of question is, so what do we do? Are we trying to do something that we have to think about as opposed to just do something that you would always do? And that's, I think, where the proposition that there are a couple of different traditions in the general area of public administration, policy, and the state, and that they are, if you wish, incongruous. They've reached a point, maybe not a divorce, but they're living in different parts of the house at the very least. These are, political science and administration with the labels. And I think what I'm hearing is that maybe the way you want to think about each of those things and the way you want to think of their relation is maybe different than many people are thinking about it. Maybe not so much to have to change the way the world thinks about it, but at least the way people in your environment think about those two nouns, administration and politics. And so I think what would be interesting is to kind of know, well, in what sort of activity do you want to work out that relationship? Do you want to construct the dialogue? Is it among your faculty colleagues, where the concern might be, as Guy presented it, how we position different avenues of doing research and different clusters of work that arises for it? Or is the conversation about maybe how to project to a larger environment what this field is? Could be both of these things, but I suggest that what you'll decide to project more broadly as your story or your narrative for the school and its various activities might be a different thing than you would project to each other. Right? Now, it would be great if the two fit together nicely, but it's not obvious how you do that. That is to say, you'd need some, we'd probably need to go beyond the realm of the sort of the limits of the conversation we've had so far to figure out how to have consonance, positive echoing between what you say is the nature of your field and discipline among faculty on the one hand, and what you're going to say to the government, to prospective students, to sponsors of all kinds. I think ideally you would be able to have that consonance, that what you're saying to each other among the faculty has something to do with what you would be saying to the larger constituencies you're engaged with, in principle. Okay. If you think that's a good idea, then you might say, well, what's kind of solution concept for having consonance between what the faculty is discussing and what you're telling the larger world? And one answer to that is you need a big idea. Okay, this is a concept in campaign planning in the military and other contexts. You need a big animating idea that will make sense in its own way to different constituencies. Maybe an idea that is, then you get into detail. Well, how much should it sound like the old ideas? How much should it sound like a new idea? How much should the idea be sort of cut and dried? We kind of know how the different parts fit together, as opposed to something that sounds maybe contradictory, maybe an oxymoron, so that there's things aren't resolved. That happens a lot, right? There are lots of precedents for that. Design science, what's that? Taking two things and political science, I don't know, taking two concepts at some point that seem to be in separate realms to mean and stick them together and so to generate a new creative synthesis. So as I haven't heard any big idea. I hear something about let's make sense of the situation we find ourselves in. Important, but perhaps a missing a piece of business to get done, the big idea. As you contemplate, so I'm going to presuppose that you're looking for a big idea, but we're still searching for it. But our big idea is to be compatible with some things that are just true of our situation. Let's take the two divisions here between political science and administration, as it was put. Interesting division. What I hear there is, I mean, what it reminds me of is my advisor, Lindblom, had a book called The Policy Process. And it started off by saying there's actually two perspectives on policy. One is about the play of power in government. That's, I think, Carlos, your who wins and who loses metaphor, very much from that. And the other has to do with intelligence. Okay? How do you get to an answer to a good policy? And these run, they don't intersect too much. You have one tradition, kind of how does government, how does it, not how it works, but how does it behave? Okay. And another tradition is how can it get to work better? And a big idea could be to get those things a little tighter together. And the fact, and Carlos, your divorce statement is, if we don't get those two things closer together, we might as well have a political science department and have an administration area and they might as well be on different campuses. So we might think about ways those, two aspects of policy, the play of power and intelligence, could be put together in I don't want to say new ways, but good ways, meaningful ways. And maybe it is in that context that we can appreciate and work with some of the things that Guy has talked to us about, because I think it's in that space, to use again, to channel Carlos and talk about creating a space within which you can have this discussion, a good metaphor. So one thing I'm hearing is that there's lots of vocabulary out there to talk about the intelligence part. Okay, we don't have to start anew. We can recruit ideas that have been, that are part of the institutional academic culture. And so one of those cultures is the Laswellian culture about the policy process. Okay, not the policy process in the play of power sense, not the policy process where the concern is to take policy as the dependent variable, to borrow Guy's comment, but a kind of idea about what's required of the people and the institutions involved in policymaking to get a outcome, a trajectory and an outcome that looks intelligent, that looks acceptable, that's closer to these, that fulfills some of the value ideals that that Guy listed, and perhaps others like human dignity, which was one of Laswell's prime ones. On this, I feel I'm, as I often am, channeling other people. Okay, on that one, I'm channeling William Dunn and his interesting recent book on pragmatism and the origins of the policy sciences. Very nice thin volume, just the right kind these days. And he says, actually, it's a pity that people who are interested in that intelligence part of policy, to use the Loomian thing, that they're not channeling Laswell enough. And why are they not channeling Laswell enough? I think, well, Guy was channeling Laswell quite a lot with all the categories about, what's required to have good policy. And I think one of the things that that raises, so I think go there, but don't just go there to find the lists. Don't go there to say that was authoritative. Get into the idea, get into their head, get into their culture, figure out why they wrote what they wrote, figure out essentially what it meant at the time. Because I think the problem here, is that those ideas have gone stale, not because they're old, but people decided not to think about them very hard. They decided that what was important was to understand policy as a dependent variable, or if they're the political scientists, okay, or the economists, well, just get the right answer, forget about the process. So I think it's if you're going to make something new, go back and look at some of these old ideas, not to salute them, not to take them as just a historical artifact, but a resource that you can leverage for purposes of coming up with your big idea that might resonate with all parties. And I think you need to reach to the past, not just reach sideways or up or down in the present. I think that's my main message with respect to that. And that then requires studying these ideas in their context, essentializing them, seeing what was in it that is still relevant to us, essentialize it and bringing it forward. That idea of that kind of intellectual problem solving is not mine. I have no new ideas, I'm afraid, but luckily I have time to read. That idea comes from this guy, okay? Look to the past, Kenneth Burke. Look to the past, it's essentialize what people said, bring that argument to the present, take out the stuff that's was specific to the time, and figure out what role it's going to play in your big idea and your detailed thinking. With Lasswell, you can get a start with Dunn, for example. That's a general problem. I've done this in the field of public management. Okay, I didn't realize I was being Burkean until after I got the book done. But that's what I was doing, and I think what you need to aim for here is the possibility of transcending the old dualities. Transcending the old dualities. Carlos, I think that's what you were asking for. If you're going to transcend the dualities, it's not just a matter of understanding the contradictions in the present. You need to understand how we got to a point where there's a divorce. Okay? Where were ideas in the past that, if we recovered them and used them in the present, might unlock the problems we have today? Transcendence. But the only reason to do transcendence is if you have something you're trying to achieve that requires it. It's not fun. It's not important in and of itself. So I think having a sense of perhaps what's needed in your overall environment will help with this integration problem. For example, and I think building on what Guy was saying one of the things is that could be unifying is an interest in getting designs that work. Okay. Well, that's one integration. I think that's a good idea, but there's maybe a dog that hasn't barked here, and this is practice. Okay, because none of this intelligence thing happens without practitioners in context, interacting in process. That's maybe a footnote to the idea of governance, but it's a pregnant footnote. Yeah, it's a really important footnote. It's so important, it might be the integrating idea. Of course, it will only be the integrating idea if you're doing the kind of teaching Luciano is doing and engaging with the practitioner community. And then the question is, what are you doing for them? And how does that relate to the big idea? Those are the questions that I think might be interesting. What, are you giving them knowledge about politics, about your first pillar, who wins, who loses? Are you giving them different schools of thought about how to deal with these general questions of what to do, like how to have good policy? Maybe with some specifics thrown in depending on the sector. So maybe the question is, well, maybe what the integration part is to have an idea of what it means to be a competent practitioner. Not universally, but in some range of situations in your environment. What would competence mean? I think that's a good question for your faculty. And I think it's a good question, and if you have an answer to that, that could be part of the big idea for the larger community. My answer to that when I teach, and that's what I tell my students from the first day, or even before the first day, is that my course is designed to get them to be competent at tackling challenges for which there is no known answer. Sounds like a good standard. Okay, then you say, well, what does that require? Well, it actually does require knowing stuff. But exactly what stuff? Does it require understanding theories that answer the general question, that pose the general question? What do we do to make government work? What do we do to get this function to work? Yes, that's part of it. Okay. Does it require being able to look at some past experience and figure out what's significant about it that would be significant for somebody who faces one of these challenges for which there's no known answer? I think that's really important. And for some reason, it hasn't been, and the general term for this is reverse engineering, but for whatever reason, it's not part of administration or politics or management. Why? Part of engineering, part of architecture. Okay. And I think this kind of thing, so that's one of the things, I think the reason is you don't have your philosophers in there, Guy. It's a number of other people. And then there's another thing which has to do with the skillful abilities of the practitioner. And those, I think, need enumeration. I tell my students that I'm working on 4 skillful abilities, and every time I encounter them, I'm going to be working on 1 or 2 of them. So by the end, they can be functioning adults. And one is making sense of situations, like we've been doing, like Carlos laid out for your situation. And this is in no particular order. Designing, which is creating representations of things that might be, that ideally would be solutions with respect to pursuits of ideal final results from systems and other creations, and as well as information that can be used in making choices about actually where to put money and how to use state authority. And thirdly, making argumentation. Being able to make a rational case about anything. We don't teach our students that. People don't come equipped to be able to make a rational case and have the person they're talking to understand that that is what they're trying to do, both. And if you try to read about making a rational case about something, it'll be a rational case about what's true, not what will work. All of the textbooks on how to make a rational case are about establishing the truth, the causation, the truth of things. When if you're going to perform that intelligence function, it's not just about the truth of things. It's about what would work. So we've got to work on that. There's things that are missing in our disciplines that are just fundamental for realizing the needs of, to fulfill the needs of government. And finally, fourthly, something I call dramatization, which you can see I subscribe to. That's a term that comes out of Irving Goffman. I'm making a distinction here between making a rational case and having what you do when you talk to people carry meaning for them. It would be great if you are able to create meaning for people that involves the rational case. That's something we need to teach people how to do. It doesn't come naturally. I keep these things separate in categories, different categories, argumentation and dramatization. Of course, there is an overarching category called rhetoric that can bring them together. But as we have to work on how to make a rational case for things and have people understand that's what you're doing, I'd like to keep rational case separate from creating meaning for people. So sense making, designing, argumentation, and dramatization, important skillful performances, they're not just skills, skillful abilities that are needed. So that combination with the right knowledge that has attentiveness to the past as well as the present, and simulated experience under instruction. All of these, I think, are important elements, particularly if your big idea is for public administration and political science to be unified around creating a practice that works. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It was also a pleasure to hear you sharing your thoughts with us. I even needed a couple of seconds to go back to my seat. So anyway, whomever wants to, yes, of course, if you, of course, it's a pleasure to have put all of you together into such a meeting. So it's a pleasure to hear you again, Carlos. And also, I want to encourage people, y no sé por qué estoy hablando en inglés, también si son bienvenidos a participar del diálogo, todos aquellos que quieren hacer preguntas o comentarios en castellano, ¿sí? Tanto Guy como Michael tienen conocimientos de castellano que permitirían entender esas preguntas o comentarios, y si no, con muchísimo gusto puedo ayudar a que los comprendan si a alguien le interesa hacer algún comentario o pregunta. Pero por lo pronto, Mi querido Carlos, levantaste la mano y te tengo en la primera página, entonces, adelante. Y quien quiera participar puede simplemente hacer como Carlos, empezar a conectar la cámara y hacer así, o usar el sistema de manos que tiene el Zoom cuando ustedes oprimen participantes o reacciones, encuentran ahí formas de irrumpir. Gracias.
Voy a hacer un comentario breve, tratando de articular dos de las ideas que pusieron Guy y Michael. Uno podría decir la big idea que demanda Michael, yo estoy de acuerdo, tiene que haber una idea que guía, que estructura, que permite fijar prioridades. ¿Qué es lo que yo siento como uno de los grandes desafíos de esa idea? Que yo creo que la tenemos, pero como dijo Guy, a veces es mucho más fácil decir cosas que implementarlas. Guy en un momento preguntó, ¿do we want to integrate? Esto es, ¿por qué vamos a dar por hecho que es bueno romper este dualismo? Yo mismo en mi introducción, en mi brevísima introducción, hice referencias a fortalezas y debilidades que nos aportaba cada una de estas aproximaciones. Porque las tienen. Y están históricamente, como marcaba Michael, están históricamente arraigadas. Hay un fundamento para esas fortalezas, no son casuales. Así como hay un fundamento para las debilidades. Y creo que porque hemos avanzado y aprendido. Entonces yo creo que lo que está en la idea que nos mueve tiene que ver con la dirección de trascender el viejo dualismo. Es verdad. Creo que hay mucho, y creo que la tarea, la obra de ustedes, de diversas formas, con diversa lógica, ha apuntado a trascender el viejo dualismo. Ahora, le veo dos problemas a esto, que son los problemas que encaramos y queremos debatir. El primero, vuelvo a repetir lo que decía Guy. Bueno, es fácil hablar de trascender dualismos. Hemos sido formados en los dualismos. Es muy difícil trascenderlos, asegurando no solamente tener la capacidad crítica, sino algo que marcaba Michael, asegurando trascender la capacidad crítica para articular este conocimiento en una etapa superior. Pero la otra parte que yo quiero marcar como un desafío, que no creo que tenga una resolución definitiva, final, sino que yo creo que es un desafío que se reproduce, tiene que ver con esto de cuánto nos integramos. Porque como Guy marcaba, no queremos perder las fortalezas que nos han mostrado cada una de estas escuelas. Queremos capitalizarlas. Y esto significa que tenemos que tener en claro cuánto integramos, cuánto generamos, cuánto pretendemos generar de nueva teoría y cuánto aprovechamos de la vieja teoría. Volver a las fuentes. Y yo creo que ese es un camino que estamos elaborando, que ustedes han estado elaborando de diversas formas hace bastante tiempo, y que nosotros queremos profundizar. Pero creo que es un camino con una respuesta todavía bastante abierta, ¿no? Porque el desafío de trascender viejas dualidades sin perder las fortalezas de esas teorías que se me presentaban como en tensión, yo creo que es el desafío que está en el centro de la elaboración de una big idea, como la que tiene que mover un área de investigación. Bueno, ese era el comentario sobre lo que yo veo como más complicado, aprovechando ideas que ustedes nos han aportado.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Carlos. Lo tuyo es un comentario más que una pregunta. Asumo que I assume you might want to go on.
Siempre puede, yo espero reacciones diciendo, no, es una pavada, eso es facilísimo.
Yo estoy tentado también de dar una opinión, pero aquí se va a transformar en algo demasiado hogareño, así que voy a esperar a ver si alguien quiere participar de la discusión con preguntas o comentarios antes de ocupar el espacio. Estoy seguro que antes de devolverle la palabra a Guy y Michael, por si desean reaccionar a tu comentario. ¿No? Que no, muy bien. Están todos muy shy tonight. Everybody's a little shy. With such presentations, how to tackle them, yeah? What to say that is not completely uninteresting or yeah, I know. Yo solo, ya que no hay otro comentario, yo quiero agregar al de... ¿A quién, perdón?
María Victoria.
Daniel.
Sí, María Victoria estaba pidiendo.
Ah, María Victoria, perdón, no te vi. Adelante, María Victoria.
Voy a, disculpándome con mis colegas de América Latina, voy a hacer la pregunta en inglés, si es posible. Si te parece bien, Luciano. Okay. I just have a question that probably is not for you, but I want you to answer it if possible. Do you see any big ideas cooking in Latin America? I mean, do you see any movement, like something that shows we might have great ideas somewhere to look for in Latin America? Yeah, I like a lot what I heard. I know, like we have to do hard work in order to learn, and by learning we could, kind of contribute to new knowledge in the fields we are interested in and we are working in and we are passionate about it. But I really have that question from my heart. I have that question. Do you see anything like some seeds of big ideas in Latin America? Both of you?
What if they say
I
no?
like that. I like, oh, yeah, I like, just seeing him laughing is good enough for me.
Guy, would you like to explain your giggling? First, connect your microphone.
Daniel creo que quería decir algo, ¿no?
I was just, I think, giggling at myself more than at the question for not really being able to think of anything like that right now. I think everyone right now has been so obsessed with for the last 13, 14 months with viruses that I don't think we're thinking that way right now. So I think what people want, in my sense, is what people in Latin America and elsewhere want right now is A, to get out of this alive, and B, to use it. And I think this is where what Michael was saying really makes a lot, is very important, is to use this as a learning experience. How do we make the system work better? I think all of our governments have failed in one way or another. Some were, some better, some failed more, some failed less, some failed at certain matters, some not at others. But what can we learn from this? So what I hope people are thinking of as a big idea is learning. How do we learn about success and failure? And not just learning sort of in an abstract, but how to systematize learning. How to essentially to build learning into the system, rather than having it an ad hoc, something we do when all else fails. So that's more aspirational than I think it is perhaps reality, but that would be my aspiration.
Thank you, Guy. Daniel, te olvidé, no
Michael
te vi
didn't answer.
pedir la palabra.
Michael is.
Michael, Michael.
Well,
I think
I
the
think
idea is
some more
gone.
questions. I mean, I think that maybe there's extra need for big ideas. It may be that it's a good environment in which to ask some of the big general old questions, but reminding oneself that perhaps the ideas we have that give us direction and answering them are not adequate. Okay, so for example, might be interesting to pay attention to some of the critical interpretive theorists in public administration. There's a guy who's now gotten out of the job, but was writing very interesting things called Cat Law, who was for years very concerned with taking for granted public administration that the state authority is strong. And he thought the big problem was maintaining anything like state authority married to some project that might be endorsed. He's not the only one who's written about that with those concerns. As Yaron Ezrahi has written about those things. He's now deceased, but he had I don't have a book here, but has a very interesting book about imagining democracy. Very concerned that people who do public policy and governance don't think about the meaning carried by the bureaucracy that they run, that by the policies that they endorse, by the other actions that take place. And the lack of meaning creation creates opportunities for people who don't like a democratic legal order to try to upset the apple cart. Well, I mean, these things were written 10, 15 years ago, seem to have come true in a lot of countries. And I think if you worry about that, then maybe some of the priorities, coming back to Carlos's term, would shift a little bit. We might even want to think, going back, why is it that we've been presupposing that issues of authority are going to not be important? Why have we not thought systematically within our discipline about how to create the show that carries the meaning of that government in a certain form works? So I don't know if this is a big idea coming out of Latin America, but you probably have quite a lot of should have a lot of interest in this question. So in Sergio and my work, we're thinking about that issue specifically in fighting corruption. Okay, what is it about the program that actually carries the meaning of a government being serious about eliminating deviance in the large and especially the small? So I don't know if that's a big idea, but there's a big agenda there, and it's not the agenda that would have been mentioned 10 years ago.
Thank you, Michael. Am I overlooking someone? Daniel, have you wanted to speak and I have overlooked you? Te querías hablar y no me di cuenta.
Sí.
Dale,
Ahí,
dale.
sí se puede. No, yo quería apuntar a una de las cosas que decía Michael para ver si puedo abundar un poquito más, pero digo desde la perspectiva en que lo hago. Yo coincido con lo que decía Carlos de la dificultad de desarmar o de superar, si es que hay que hacerlo, de ciertas distinciones que acompañan tradiciones que vienen de hace mucho tiempo y están súper arraigadas, ¿no? Ahora, siempre que se trascienden algunas diferencias es porque se plantean diferencias más importantes, ¿no? O sea, una distinción se hace secundaria frente a una distinción más importante que aparece, ¿no? Y en ese sentido yo quería recuperar una cosa que dijo Michael, que es, a lo mejor la referencia no está solo en las grandes ideas, sino que está también en el diálogo con la práctica del hacer política pública, ¿no? Me pareció entender que Michael lo que decía es que él le preocupa el proceso de formación de quienes están involucrados en la producción de políticas y casi uno diría las virtudes que deben desarrollarse, y mencionaba estas 4 que me parecieron reinteresantes. Y a mí eso me sitúa en otra distinción que acompaña a las 2 tradiciones, que es, y en el sentido que hay disputas internas que las atravesaron y que las estructuraron, ¿no? Que básicamente uno podría decir que es la postura de quien dice qué debería hacer quien produce políticas y quiere controlar lo que hace porque está mal, ¿no? Que así surge, yo creo, el análisis de política en los años 50, y así surgen las reacciones, por ejemplo, la de Lindblom, a ese tipo de enfoques, ¿no? Es un debate en donde la práctica política está entre ser controlada, racionalizada, etcétera, o ser comprendida y mejorada, y incorporarle aprendizaje, etcétera. Y lo mismo me parece que pasa también en la administración pública, ¿no? En donde hubo enfoques también más racionalistas que decían cómo se hacían las cosas, y finalmente otros que dijeron eso no explica demasiado lo que efectivamente se hace, ¿no? Y a mí me parece que esa segunda distinción que atraviesa, digo, las 2 tradiciones como debates internos, puede ser también un buen punto de partida para empezar a ver si no hay que trabajar sobre otras distinciones para poder reintegrar el campo y hacerlo más productivo. Y a mí me parece que el acercamiento con la práctica, para completar la pregunta de María Victoria, ahí, no solo buscar las grandes ideas, sino cuáles son las grandes transformaciones en la actividad política que nos demandan pensamiento y que nos demandan seguir produciendo conocimientos y herramientas sobre esto, ¿no? Entonces, no sé si entendí bien, Michael, pero a mí me parece que no sé qué dimensión le das a esto de una disciplina que tiene que acercarse a la práctica profesional, a sus virtudes y a sus necesidades de aprendizaje en el tema de la estructuración o el futuro en el que puede evolucionar este campo.
Gracias, Daniel. Julián, antes de que le devuelva la palabra a nuestros invitados, me pidió la palabra. Julián, todo tuyo.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Lo que planteo es algo un poco más específico, pero aprovecho esto y desde ya agradezco la posibilidad de tener un intercambio con 2 distinguidas personalidades de nuestro campo como Guy Peters y Michael Barzelay. Particularmente me interesa mucho y he estudiado recientemente un aspecto que vincula estas distintas disciplinas, y es un poco la coherencia del gobierno, ¿sí? La coherencia, la organización del gobierno, organización no como una agencia, sino como un atributo, como una cualidad del gobierno organizado o coherente. Y he podido estudiar sectores como el de transporte, y ahora estoy estudiando un poco el sector de la energía nuclear. Y efectivamente en Argentina. Y efectivamente uno nota un grado de desorganización muy importante, y recordemos que esa estructura de implementación de políticas, es decir, lleva política, o sea, acarrea, pasan por ahí políticas, y a su vez ese grado de desorganización muestra poderes burocráticos muy diversos que compiten entre sí. Y una necesidad importante, y que ha sido más allá de lo que se ha hablado sobre la importancia del Estado y del gobierno, ha perdido un rol importante el gobierno central, es decir, la administración central en esos sectores, que tienen muchas empresas, organizaciones no gubernamentales. Entonces, la pregunta a los colegas, quizás por lo que ha trabajado un poco el tema, quizás un poco más Guy en este sentido, pero es ¿qué ha ocurrido comparativamente en los últimos años en Europa, en Norteamérica, respecto al proceso de cierta atomización que puede haber sucedido en los distintos sectores, y si ha habido estrategias para volver a fortalecer el centro del gobierno para darle mayor coherencia. ¿Y cuáles han sido algunas de esas estrategias?
Muchas gracias, Julián. Antes de pasarte la palabra, Guillermo, le paso la palabra a Guy, ¿te parece bien? ¿Sí? Guy, go ahead.
Can you give me a translation? I got some of it, but my Spanish isn't that good.
Would you mind, Julián, to ask your question in English?
I'm sorry.
That would be simpler than me translating.
Okay. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that, but I'll try. I'll do my best. Well, I was just talking about coherence and organization in our governments, and my question is, in your research and your study in the last 20 years or 25 years in, I don't know, in North America and Europe, what has been done to strengthen the center of the government, to provide more organization, more coherence? What have been successful strategies to strengthen that core, that center part of the government that deals with planning, with coherence, with coordination, collaboration, etc.?
How long do you have for the answer? I mean, but I mean, that's been one of the big themes. So we went through a period when essentially we're giving things away from the center, assuming then that creating agencies, decentralization, etc., to solve our governance problems. But that turned out to be not really true. So then there's been this attempt to try to move things back to the center. And there have been any number of ways of trying to do this. I don't know, there's the book that Ed Buchard and Kuhn Behus and I did on this about 10 years ago, mapped it to. Essentially, governments keep trying a variety of different things. So Kuhn and Ed and I have just done a paper on this. And looking at, it's not by no means novel sort of framework, but using the familiar hierarchy, markets, and networks type of framework to look at what governments have been doing. And looking then not only at programs, processes, and budgets. And what you get then is a huge matrix of various efforts at trying to create more coherence. Now, my favorite of these, since I was involved in designing it, Herod and I and Gary Ormond worked for the Prime Minister of Finland for several years, right? Because he was concerned with that very question. And he was a huge guy, just a great big man, sitting behind this great big desk. And we go in to meet him the first day, and he says, "I can't do anything. They gave it all away." So our task was to pull some of it back. And what this is what we did, and what's now actually been copied, particularly in the Baltic republics, is a system of essentially of a government by matrix, where you maintain the traditional ministries. So you still have agriculture, defense, all the traditional ministries. But then running across that are a series of priorities. So for this government that's just been elected, whatever the government may be, what 4 or 5 things are your big priorities? And then you find out that almost every department in government has something to do with most of those priorities. So then you have to figure out a way to knit all that together. But to give a lot of power then to the ministers and these heads and the civil servants who are responsible for the horizontal part of governing. And again, it's worked extremely well for the Finns. Even in the case of of fairly radical coalition governments. So the government we were working with at the time had at one end had communists and the other end had conservatives. 7-party government. They went across the political spectrum. And still they were able to come up with party programs with these, again, with a set of priorities. So that's my, there are lots of these things. So that I think is one that I find particularly interesting.
Thank you very much, Guy. Yeah, that's wonderful. Guillermo Schweinheim, ¿estás allí? ¿Estás allí? ¿Estás allí? Ahí te veo.
Ahí estoy.
Si vas a querer que traduzca, avísame antes, no hagas como Julián, que primero hizo su pregunta y después...
Es posible. Es posible. Bueno, en el debate que se ha generado la tarde, de la mano de Michael y de Guy, yo me voy a colocar del lado de la necesidad de la separación. Es decir, al menos en América Latina, de la necesidad de seguir reforzando, aunque es muy importante que nos juntemos, los enfoques puramente administrativos y los enfoques de política pública. Y la razón principal es que no es teórica, sino que en América Latina no tenemos burocracia de carrera y de mérito, al igual que en el capitalismo avanzado. Y por lo tanto, la intervención de personal no calificado en la gestión de sistemas administrativos genera un infradesarrollo de todos nuestros sistemas administrativos y de gestión. Y eso nosotros no nos podemos olvidar. Y si bien en consecuencia es deseable desde la investigación una búsqueda de una investigación que integre el Public Policy Analysis con Public Administration, Public Management, o incluso el enfoque de gobernanza, como nos planteó Guy, debo decir de que tenemos que ser muy celosos de seguir investigando al fenómeno administrativo como tal y formando administradores públicos en un lugar donde los administradores no son normalmente de carrera. Y entonces creo que faltará un trecho bastante largo y que nosotros necesitamos reforzar los estudios y la enseñanza de la dimensión administrativa por sí misma durante un periodo prolongado hasta que en algún momento América Latina vaya a una consolidación de un servicio civil que todavía no tiene. Y te pido que lo traduzcas.
Okay, no, I think it's clear enough for you guys what Guillermo said. He said he doesn't believe, he believes, I will say very, very shortly, that the separation ought to be maintained in countries like ours where civil service is not sufficiently developed or not developed, but strong enough to sustain, to bear the charge of government. And then his point of view is not that doesn't derive from any academic belief, but from a necessity to do this in this particular conjuncture of the history of Latin American countries. That would be the point. Am I being, estoy reflejando adecuadamente tu punto de vista?
Wonderful. Okay. That's why I really think.
Gracias, Guillermo. Okay, is there anyone of you, either Guy or Michael, that would like to make any other comments relative to the questions and other comments that we have received so far?
Well, I could try.
Sure, go ahead.
A little bit. So I'll pick up on Julian's questions. I mean, I tend to look at, I like studies that are about an actual experience. where there is a kind of set of issues that relate to what you're interested in. Now, maybe they define the issues a little bit differently than coherence, let's say. So when you say, when you use the term and express your interest, I think of studies, for example, like Alan Schick's 1979 study on the New Zealand case, The Spirit of Reform, which I've written about his study, in the NPM book. So I think I would, that would be a benchmark case of an attempt to get coherence. I think you might want to look at that study and say, well, is that a good way to study an experience from which we could learn something? Okay, and if so, we could learn something about the attempt to have coherence. I think it's a very finely done study. I think it's just about one of the best studies of an actual experience I've come across. And you may want to sort of reverse engineer that study as you get a little more clarity on it. So for example, the background is that as a kind of counterbalance, a countermeasure to counterbalance against the Treasury, which was doing a lot of creating coherence on its own. In New Zealand, another agency was set up, the SSA, basically the personnel agency with a larger mandate, State Services Commission, SSC. And he was hired by the SSC to make the argument that the Treasury approach wasn't the be-all and end-all approach for getting coherence. And I think the line, he sort of took was, well, getting a sort of static efficiency out of the public sector is one way to define your ideal final result, but it's not the only one. Okay, don't be a prisoner of that view. That's a very particular view. Match the way, match the political agenda, match the people who were recruited into the roles, economists. But there's also a kind of innovation need, long-term, kind of a long-term developmental agenda for the government and the society. And that's a different purpose of coherence than more static efficiency. So I think there's a general warning there, which is don't take an organizational concept, essentially, which is contentless, like centralization or coherence, and run with that. Okay, you need, I think, to be more clear about what is the nature of the challenge, the nature of the intent. And then if you have that in mind, then you can look at different cases, which are, if you wish, better or worse at what they tried to do. If it was get ready to the future, get coherence, implement presidential priorities in a certain period of time, and you need a more fine-grained definition of the concern. Once you get there, and that can go back and forth between looking at the cases, okay, and then thinking what was important about them. So the thing I did on Brazil in Action, the important thing was executing on presidential priorities, despite the fact that a lot of the ministers didn't want to execute on presidential priorities because they were from other parties, but that's what it was. And the big idea was make the government look like it could get big stuff done that mattered for the future development of the country. If you look at the EU cases I did, that was more, how do we respond to a strategic threat from our authorizing environment? So that the commission could actually play something like the role that it had played in the past. After a disaster where the whole commission resigned in 1999. And they found some interesting answers to that even they didn't anticipate in advance. Got an article on that. So I think if you go kind of back and forth between a slightly more flexible idea, more contentful idea of coherence, and cases that have been analyzed because they're interested in it, I think you'll get a better question. And I think for you, getting a better question is the first step. I had some comments on Danielle, but which is just kind of opening up a topic, which is, seems to me,
Go ahead.
there's a big issue about you know, what kind of knowing, what kind of knowledge is actually going to be useful, not necessarily for application, but to Guy's point, for further learning, and learning in a way that will produce something that works. Okay, I find very fecund the ideas about design, not the design that you read about in the ideal books about going and being empathetic and forgetting about the past and just doing something that is acceptable and seems to be a neat idea, but designing in a more, I don't want to say traditional, I don't think that's a useful idea, but more of an engineering sense, where what is being, what is guiding, what is influencing the moves people make in solving a problem includes what people have thought about in the past, but where that's useful because the people solving the problem don't think of themselves as experts, applying what is known and acting within their expertise. They think of themselves as designers and creators using knowledge as a basis for making analogies about what could be possible. And I don't know if that's a useful idea in a political environment or institutional environment where people aren't civil servants, but I don't think it could hurt. I don't know if that's a response to what you said, Daniel, but that's what I got.
No worries. This is an open conversation that has been provoked by your two interventions, so you're not obliged to answer anything.
I tried.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos los que han participado hasta ahora. Si alguien tiene algún otro comentario que quiera hacer, es bienvenido. Todavía tenemos unos minutos más, si lo desean, y si no, estoy mirando a ver si alguien levanta la mano en alguna de las ventanas. Veo que no. No, solamente, bueno, entonces voy a tomarme la libertad de cerrar la reunión. Solo quisiera agregar estuve escuchando con mucho interés y estuve tentadísimo muchas veces de intervenir, pero por supuesto que no lo voy a hacer. Solo quería agregar que, bueno, es la intención que lleva a muchas de las cosas que hemos estado haciendo con Carlos en el último tiempo, el de crear una instancia de diálogo entre estas dos ramas. Carlos y yo venimos, digamos, o nos interesa a cada uno de nosotros más una que la otra, pero venimos dialogando sobre esto, y estamos comprometidos, creo yo, en crear un ámbito en el cual no sé si hay necesidad de que se superen las diferencias entre estas dos perspectivas. No sé si es totalmente necesario eso, pero sí es necesario que las dos perspectivas sean profundizadas y transmitidas, sobre todo a nuestros estudiantes, y sobre todo de las dos perspectivas, en el caso de nuestra universidad y probablemente nuestro país, y en eso voy a coincidir brevemente con mi colega Guillermo. Nuestra pata floja es el estudio acerca de la funcionalidad de los artefactos que creamos para resolver problemas políticos. Nos fascinamos con la discusión que trata de interpretar la arena política, y eso es comprensible, pero tenemos mucho trabajo en pensar en términos de funcionalidad, en pensar en términos de estos artefactos, estos organismos artificiales de los que hablaba Herbert Simon, que hacen posible obtener, como dice Michael en sus escritos, alineamiento de resultados con propósitos, casi de manera independiente, digo yo en clase a veces provocando a propósito, casi de manera independiente a cuál propósito tengas, ¿sí? Y esta perspectiva en nuestra academia no es la más fuerte, y en nuestra escuela hemos tratado de ir reforzándola. Yo en el grado me divierto muchísimo cuando con los estudiantes discutimos cosas como, ok, y si vas a la reunión en la que le vas a plantear a tu jefe político que este es tu plan, ¿cómo se lo vas a decir? ¿Cómo vas a desplegar adelante de un líder político un cálculo de costo-beneficio que sea comprensible y que no sea simplemente algo abstracto derivado de alguna teoría normativa del bien, de alguna lectura trasnochada de Rawls o de Marx, ¿sí? ¿Cómo vas a poner en acción competencias que permitan planificar y dialogar con un mundo, con el mundo de la política pública en un país en vías de desarrollo, donde los recursos son escasos, los tiempos son escasos, los conflictos son polarizantes? ¿Cómo vas a sobrevivir en ese ámbito y tratar de hacer funcionar una empresa política? Sea cual sea su objetivo, ¿no? Y yo estoy convencido de que esta pata es menos fuerte, coincido con Guillermo en nuestro caso, que nuestras capacidades de rastrear lo que ocurre en las arenas políticas, y entonces nuestro área, entre otras cosas, yo empujo porque profundice los estudios de caso, profundice las aproximaciones profesionalizantes a los problemas de política pública, y complete un lado de la perspectiva en el que claramente es mucho más floja. Sobre todo nosotros producimos administradores públicos, ¿no? Entonces, esto es bastante importante para nosotros. Muchísimas gracias por habernos ayudado, Guy y Michael, a pensar nuestros problemas. Muchísimas gracias por escuchar que les interesa que los problemas sean puestos en contexto y sean universales y al mismo tiempo singulares. It was a pleasure to have you. We are very pleased to have listened to you and to have been to have created a situation in which you could interact with us. And I hope this is not the last time that we can bother you for this. Y muchísimas gracias a todos los que participaron por su interés y por acompañarnos en esta tarde de hoy. Y ojalá sea hasta muy pronto. Hasta luego. Cuídense.
Muchas gracias. Un placer.
Carlos, ¿querés decir algo más? Adelante.
Gracias y saludos.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Well orchestrated, Luciano.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks
so
very much. Hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Gracias.
bye.